society on its development trajectory? Have we become so bitterly divided that Western culture itself is now falling apart? How can we urgently reunite society so that we can come together to tackle many of the pressing problems that we're facing? To address some of these questions, I'm joined today by Jeff Salzberg, who is the host of the Daily Evolver podcast. Jeff is a long-standing student and teacher of integral theory, exploring the evolution of human consciousness and culture. In this interview, Jeff introduces the concept of integral thinking, a model that offers the very real possibility to break through the polarization and find a way that respects the needs of the whole of society and not just the few, and perhaps offer some clues into how society itself may increase along the maturity curve. Now, Elevate remains committed to bringing a range of guests who are able to bring different perspectives that may even challenge our own. However, we're increasingly fighting the algorithm as we do so, bringing you counterculture conversations that challenge the status quo and push against the edges of the systems and structures. So please, if you haven't done so already, take a moment of your time to go to danastingregory.com/podcast. Join our mailing list to make sure you never miss a beat. Thanks again. It's a pleasure to be here with you today with Jeff Salzberg. My name is Dan Astin-Gregory. This is the Elevate podcast. Jeff, as you heard in the intro, I discovered your work through a conversation you had on another podcast, the Deep Transformation podcast, where you spoke about the cultural wars and some of the underlying factors that may be contributing to those things. It's quite clear that society is bitterly divided. It seems that our differences are not purely political anymore. They are cultural, social, multi-layers of our being, our own identity. I wanted to bring you on to try and make some deeper, to have some deeper sense making around these divides, the cultural wars and polarization, and hopefully signpost some ways that we can start to think differently about some of these problems. So I'd be interested to start by exploring your take on what's potentially driving these divides, this polarization, the culture wars, to get some context from your perspective.
Yeah, well, thanks. I think what's driving the culture wars is evolution itself, which is the same thing that has been driving the emergence of reality since the Big Bang, really. I mean, if we want to just look at the animating energetic of the cosmos, it is growth in complexity. And humanity, of course, is one of the fruits of this evolution as we look at history. And what integral theory posits is that evolution continues in the interiority of the human consciousness. So we see consciousness having evolved through, there's lots of ways you can slice and dice the evolution of human consciousness and culture as we look at history. We tend to talk about 6 stages, one being indigenous, this being humanity basically before fire, then tribal, humanity after fire, then sort of this empire consciousness that arose, the sort of Genghis Khan, Rome. Now, at this point, we get different stages of consciousness online at the same time. For most of humanity, it was just indigenous back for 95% of human history. Then what arises after that is the first of the worldviews, if you will, or identities that are really part of the active culture war right now. And that is the arising of the traditional worldview. And this is something that happened about 2,000 years ago, all across the world. Very strange how this happens. But it's this idea of there being a transcendent good, a God, a heaven, a nirvana, as opposed to the world that we all live in, the fallen world. And so that kicks off most of recent human history, where the world is saturated in this divine truth. And a lot of people living right now, that in fact, the vast majority of people on the planet still basically vibe to this worldview. These in the developed world, it's the social conservatives, it's the God and country people. And in the United States, that's probably a hard 25% of the population, and maybe 35% sort of basically vibe there. And then we have the arising, this is a few hundred years ago, of modernity. And this is where rationality comes online, and this idea that the world is understandable in its own terms. And I can think my way through. And it's not about faith and obedience as much as it is about, wow, we've got this world in front of us, we can create something. And so modernity comes in and creates the modern world. It's amazing. But we move from a world where God is everywhere to a world where God is nowhere. I mean, what modernity does and secularism does is it banishes the idea of God. And, I can see that in my own life. I was raised a good little Christian boy. And at about 12 or 13, by ninth grade science, I was thinking, wait a minute, I don't know about this. And we move into the rational world. And so that's another of the worldviews that is online right now in contention with traditionalism. To further complexify the situation, we have the arising of the next stage of consciousness. And this is maybe 100 years ago, certainly came to fluorescence in the 60s. And this is the postmodern worldview, or what we would call the sensitive self. And this is the self that comes online and wants basically to deconstruct the triumphalist narratives of history. I mean, after World War II, any idea that my race or my country was superior, all of that became anathema. And so we move into this new world where we want to bring the people back who have been shut out. So we have civil rights, animal rights. We become world-centric, and we start understanding the environmental devastations of modernity. And so that is the worldview of the progressive, liberal, woke strata of society. And these three, and primarily the two, traditionalism and progressivism, are at I won't say a hot war, because it's not. It's a culture war. And that is an important distinction. Hot wars happen, but they're far less prevalent in these later, particularly after modernity. Traditionalism does a lot of hot wars. Modernity starts to cool that down. And but what we have is a very vicious and contentious culture war between these identities and worldviews. And from evolution's perspective, evolution likes this. Evolution fights its way. One of the ways that evolution moves forward is by, survival, fighting each other. We also do it by friending. And so here we are fighting and friending our way forward. And from an integral perspective, which we want to take kind of a 40,000-foot view of this situation. It's like we're up halfway up a mountain, and we can see these tribes down in the valley. And we see that they all have a piece of the truth. And Integral wants to integrate the best of these truths. So we want this obedience and sense of community and culture and even enchantment, that the world is enchanted. We want that back online. Modernity, of course, disenchants the world. We want that with rationality, which is the gift of modernity. And then we also want that with sensitivity of let's have a world that's equity and sustainability. And we want all three of those to be online, and they're not. they are. You've got to work at it. But in the culture at large, what we're seeing is polarization of these worldviews because they're coming more and more into focus. Social media, the ways that we are informed, they're just getting more and more contracted in a sense. And that's the differentiation before the integration from an integral point of view.
I mean, it's fascinating to observe. I mean, I was thinking as you were sharing the kind of evolutionary path. I've studied the 1960s in particular depth and seeing how the counterculture movement of the time created or accelerated the rise of postmodernity, progressivism. And I can see the kind of visceral anti-establishment energy that came with. In fact, in my 20s, I kind of long craved to experience something of that nature myself. And perhaps now I am in a different way, in a different time. Just not seeing the mass prevalence of psychedelics yet, but even that is changing.
Big factor in the emergence of postmodern culture.
Yes, but where I have a lesser understanding, but I'm curious, is looking at the transition from the traditional way of thinking to modernity, and through the Age of Enlightenment, and the fractures that must have emerged at the time in a similar fashion. It's trying to understand how these fractures in history have played out to better understand how we can move potentially towards this integral way of thinking. Do you think the tensions that arise amongst these different ways of seeing the world are necessary as part of the evolutionary path?
I do, actually. And, that doesn't mean that it has to happen in any particular way. And there are healthier and unhealthier ways for it to happen. And one of the ways I think it's really helpful when we look at the evolution of culture and consciousness is to just look at the evolution of an individual human being. It's really in many ways the same thing. It's not the same thing, and there's, whatever. But the idea of growth being built in to the system is really helpful, because is it progress for a bright-eyed 11-year-old to turn into a surly, rebellious 14-year-old? Is that progress? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yes.
it is. In terms of evolution and growth. It doesn't
Yes.
look like it. It doesn't feel like it. And so there's a lot of, misunderstanding. If you talk about the evolution of consciousness and we're moving forward and so forth, it doesn't have to happen in any particular way. Susie has her path, and John has his path, and every culture has its own identity. Every individual has their own identity, but yet we can see that there's something about being 4 years old. There's something about being 7 years old. There's something about being 18 years old. There's actually something about being 30 and 40 and 50 and 60. And we can see in the broad strokes of history that these stages do come online sequentially. There is something that's powering that. I mean, 13.8 billion years ago, something blew out of nothing. And it, subatomic particles, I don't know what, a lot of hydrogen, I guess. And there's the old joke, how do you make the modern world? Well, you take a big mess of hydrogen and leave it alone for 13.8 billion years. I mean, something's going on here, right? And so is that going to stop? No. Our grandchildren are going to be as different from us as we are from our grandparents. And a lot of what we see as the degeneration of the younger generation and social media and whatever, all the critiques, they're moving their way forward. They're supposed to be a disappointment to us. Just as, when I think of, if my grandparents who loved me and I lived on, I grew up in their laps, if they thought that I was going to be an atheist homosexual, If that was where I was going to end up, or an agnostic or whatever, at least I was. I'm actually a lot more spiritual now than I was for several decades. They would not have thought that was progress. But here I am. I'm a good citizen. And our grandchildren will be as shocking to us. And it's interesting to think of how and what is going on in this current moment that is revealing that. Where's the stream moving? And that's just endlessly interesting. And we don't exactly know, just like we don't know what's going to happen to any particular kid, and it can go bad. But the built-in animating energetic of emergence has to be factored in, and it's not generally by the mainstream intellectuals, intelligentsia. It's just not factored in. They're blind to it.
Do you think within the kind of evolutionary process, what drives the kind of new epoch of worldview or thinking is an excess, is driving the existing worldview to its excesses? So, for example, postmodernism has brought this embrace of subjectivity, which was more focused on objectivity within modernism, but in excess now has created almost this post-truth reality where reality itself is no longer distinguishable or based upon observable fact. It's more fluid than this now. I see this playing out within the culture wars in a way that's creating then resistance. It creates a greater sense of resistance once it seemingly pushes towards the boundaries of its manifestation. And I wonder if that becomes a catalyst of the culture war itself by going into excess, and how you define excess is very subjective in itself. Does that trigger the culture war, and therefore does that also trigger the kind of next phase of evolution by pushing those boundaries, or does it create a sense? Because I get a sense of the resistance almost feels like it's a pendulum effect as opposed to a spiral or an evolving process in terms of the way it's playing out in the present moment political climate, where you're almost seeing the counterculture movement now becoming one of conservatism as opposed to progressivism. It's almost taking an opposite, but at least it feels like that. But it'll take time to see how it's actually evolving. I'm curious to know your observations around these things.
Yeah, well, there is a pendulum. There's a polarity that is just built into the cosmos. But the clock is moving forward. So to the degree that there's a new right that is emerging, it's not the old right. It's a right that has been informed by the pendulum swing to the left. So it's and every stage. Well, first of all, I want to say this is that at our current state of the world and of most of our consciousness, we are operating at many different stages at the same time. And that's actually really important with Integral, is that we want to see that even, American culture or British culture has its own version, but American culture, we have the postmodern 25%, we have the traditionalist 25%, we have the 50% in the middle who's tried to negotiate the two. But we all have within us different lines of development. We can be at a postmodern stage in terms of our sort of ideas about how the world should be, and still at an earlier stage when it comes down to interpersonal or emotional relationships. And so we see people online arguing for these higher stages of development, but they're doing it from an earlier stage of development, if you will. And that's just the current modern mess. And we can still see that there's probability clouds, that there are trends that are happening, and that every stage comes online. And this is within the culture, and it's within us individually as well, with a certain fanaticism. When I accepted Jesus as my personal savior, that was it, man. That was how I saw the world. That's what I wanted to argue for. That's what I wanted to convince everybody of. It blew my mind. It expanded my world. Then when I lost my religion, it was the same thing. So all of a sudden, that was the new reality. And then when I saw the limits of modernity and the sort of sterility of modern, secular logical thinking, materialism. And of course, we have fanatic religious people, we have fanatic materialists.
Yes, indeed.
Both of those are true. And yes, in some ways, their excesses push us forward, because we realize we can't just be protoplasm hurtling through space on a rock. It's got to be more than that, And so we move into what postmodernity sort of did. It brought back, you could be religious as long as it wasn't Christianity. You could work with energies, you could go into the woods, you could, a lot of the postmodern spirituality is really progress. And then, from an integral perspective, we want to see, what's best in all of this, and in the simplest terms, hold multiple worldviews same time. Even though they're at war, we actually have a space of consciousness that can accommodate all three of them. And actually the earlier ones too, and that's a whole other story, is how humanity is currently wanting to bring back magic, indigenous wisdom, and so forth. That's a huge move. Humanity's doing it. It's astonishing to look and see how much we're getting right in this fight.
Yes, I mean, my observation, Gen Z in particular, or Gen Z, as you might say, in the US, is they in particular, I think, are finding fascination in the magical and the indigenous. It's bringing a kind of renaissance of, and it's piqued my curiosity of the history of everything, which I don't have enough of that.
It's still alive in us.
Yes,
I mean, it didn't go away. It got repressed. It got talked out of. It got ganged up on, but it's still there, and it spikes from time to time. And to know that, and to say, I can't wait a second. I want to go back here and re-explore and re-mine the consciousness of humanity, this hard-fought achievement that each of us have done individually, but so has humanity. And respect that. And it's exciting.
Yes, it is exciting. I mean, you mentioned the piece around religion and spirituality. I think this is something I've started to examine with a deeper set of lenses, and the fanaticism you mentioned, because what I'm observing, and others have made similar observations, is that since the kind of move from the traditional view where religion was the dominant worldview through the Enlightenment phase into modernity, then postmodernity, it feels like there's been different approaches to try and attempt to fill what some call the God-shaped hole. I've had some really interesting guests on who've talked about the kind of limitations of some of the new age type spiritual practices that emerged from the 60s, and how some of those became overly commercialized. They call it the plastic fantastic. It's the kind of go to the yoga class and in the morning, and then scowl at the homeless person asking for change as you walk out. It's not exactly, it's mechanical rather than spiritual at that point. And that there are now new obsessions showing up in a fanatical way that play out in the way that kind of emphasize this God-shaped hole within people. And it seems like people are still yearning to try and find a way. And those who are of the traditional view, of course, are advocating that the particular religion, whether it's Christianity or any other faith, is the solution to that hole. And clearly, that's where it's evolved from in the first instance. And it seems that people are still seeking. And do you think that Integral provides a way to fill that hole?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. First of all, I think that the religion that I would sort of imagine is next is the religion of emergence itself. Of recognizing that there is something that is, powering this complexification of, first of all, matter, second, life, and third, consciousness. And that's every society has recognized that there is some reality beyond the veil, except modernity. Modernity just got rid of all of it. Fair enough. It had to, actually, because the pre-modern religions are all brutal. They think that they're the only right one, and their job is to bring God's heaven to earth, or whatever. The Buddhists do it too, even though they're presumably non-theistic. But so any idea that we want to go back to the idea that this religion is the right one, modernity has that's no longer possible. I mean, people will do it, and it may even be the right thing for an individual person to do. I'm not saying that. Everybody's on their own path here. But the religion of tomorrow and the emerging religion of today has to be one that basically includes as many truths as possible from earlier religions. And I would just offer a very simple little sort of a technique for doing that. And that is that one of the teachings of Ken Wilber, at least in the integral world, is that human reality arises in three fundamental dimensions: first person, second person, and third person. Okay? And every language is constructed around these realities, and it's just how we live. So there's this first person, there's this Jeffness, there's this interiority of me that is, I want to notice that, and I want to see that that's its own world. And actually, there's a set of religions that specialize in this. And that's the religions of meditation, introspection, contemplation. These are all important streams of religious intelligence. Then there's the second person. And this is my relationship with other people. And even from a spiritual perspective, my relationship to spirit in second person. So the specialist here is Christianity and the theistic religions that posit a loving parent God, if you will, or a savior or a mother. This is juicy stuff. It's whatever reality ultimately is very happy to show up in second person for those of us who want it. Okay? So that's another area that we can work on and take seriously. Not that I'm contacting my higher self, I'm contacting another. I'm contacting a loving intelligence that sees me and loves me. So that's second person. And then third person is the nature religions. Essentially, it's the reenchantment of the world that we live in. And not the natural world for sure, which is easy. You go on a hike and you see the waterfall and the clouds and the trees, and you can talk to them. They talk back. There's a second person quality to that. This is human religion for 99.9% of human history, was this kind of religion. It just was all just ever present and liquid. And so those three categories of spiritual practice, from an integral perspective, you want to at least acknowledge all three. You may specialize in one. It's all kind of nascent. It's emerging. There's no real catechism here yet, but I think it's going to be something like that.
Mm-hmm. I think what's interesting in this kind of examination is recognizing the need for integral, in the sense that the way that these differences are playing out very viscerally, playing out very aggressively. Even in the context of the conversation we just had around the kind of God-shaped hole, a recent guest who was examining the kind of rise of woke culture was talking about how it has a almost religious nature to it, and in its excesses, again, has a fanatic component and insists that it's right and that everything else, therefore, is wrong. And we've seen that through religion. We've seen it through other paths, whether it's materialism. It's again comes to the point where things reach excesses, where things start to grate upon the boundaries of that. And I think we're seeing that now within the culture war, which to me signposts the absolute need for an ability to hold multiple perspectives at the same time. But also I recognize in my own self a desire to pursue that level of integral thinking where I'm able to hold those positions and respect them. And to some degree, I think I've been able to do that throughout my career politically, which will bring us to a conversation about the difference between integral and political centrism, I think, in a moment. But ahead of that, I also recognize where I have stronger views outside of a certain position. I find myself, when I become attached to those stronger views, then it disturbs the integral view. You know, I come out of that synergy where I'm able to hold the multiple perspectives. It doesn't mean I'm no longer acknowledging the previous views, but I'm being very strong in a particular area which is slightly outside of integral. Could you speak to that challenge when it comes to pursuing an integral view whilst having, you know, very strong polarizing views on subjects?
Yeah, well, we're all, you know, standing on the shoulders of our culture, and we're all expressing that, and we all have our individual points of view. And, you know, integral's not about getting rid of that. Integral's about becoming unclenched about that, so that I can still see my preferences. I still have to vote. I still have to make binary decisions. I still have to make judgments. What I don't have to do as much is condemn. I don't have to condemn people who think differently than me as much as I used to. I still do, but not as much as I used to. And you know, just to take you know, one of the things that we do at Integral is we sort of become friendlier to the culture war. You know, we normalize the idea that people fight their way forward. That's part of the deal. I wish it wasn't so, but it apparently is. And so what that does is, so then let's say that I have a lot of antibodies or allergies to woke, you know, this new religion. Yes, of course, it has religious qualities. So does environmentalism with the apocalypse, and we brought it on ourselves, and we have to do X, Y, Z in order to repent. And it doesn't mean it's not true. You know, everything came on religiously in human history. And so wokeness does too. And you don't have to buy the exoteric woke explanation of reality in order to get the download. And it's a little bit like when Christianity comes online in history. It reorganizes the world. It is brought forward by fanatics who think that for them it is. It's like, what an amazing thing that they realized. And that's it. But you don't have to become a fanatic Christian in order to grow into the fruits of that, which is a certain kind of civilization, conformity, obedience, what's necessary for human beings to move into that next stage of complexity and culture. So to take that and apply it to woke. So we have the woke priests, you know, we have the woke catechism, we have the woke everything. But you don't have to buy all of that in order to get the download, which is that we do want a more equitable world. And that there is, and it's doing its job. If you think of anti-racism, the idea that it's not enough to be colorblind. Colorblind was modern, okay? Postmodern is we have to rectify, we have to reparation, whatever it might be. but you can see that there is a de facto anti-racism that has come online in our world, where you don't want to be part of a board of directors that's only white anymore. You know what I mean? You want there to be women. You want there to be, there's something that is arising in the contemporary leading edge of culture that is, whether or not they buy into the, woke ideology, are getting the actual download and moving forward. We want a world where everybody's in. It's not okay to have a subculture of people defined by race and poverty. It's just, it's, just being, leveling the playing field isn't enough. We have to bring them forward. And there's, we're confused and we're fighting and we're conflicted, but that's coming online. In some ways, I can see it as under its own power. You know what I mean? I mean, there are people who are leading the way and all that, but there's just a natural emergence of this new sensitivity. They just outlawed having dogs on chains in Texas. You can no longer tie up your dog in Texas. I grew up with, everybody had a dog tied up behind the garage. This kind of thing is, de facto emerging, despite all of the ideologies, or probably because of all the ideologies that are at war.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The idea, there's a reasonable amount of people within my community that struggle with the woke culture and have a resistance, and I'd say I include myself in that. But many of them have the intent behind it is actually what the original intent, the purest intent, not the manifestation of that intent. I think there's a disagreement with, or a strong disagreement in many cases, of the means of which the intent has manifested, the means of which it's being attained, as opposed to the original intent, which I think creates new opportunities. And there's actually a lot of people I know that are very cause driven, but they feel misaligned at the moment. It's that many people feel politically homeless, and I think many people feel misaligned and homeless because they can't actually find, they don't want to become the latest social justice warrior. They want to support social causes, but the vehicles that are emerging are less desirable to groups of people than what's present. So I think it's very interesting to observe how that's playing out. The download, as you speak, is actually the origining. It's really the problem that the thing is trying to solve, that the movement is trying to solve. It's just there is always many different ways to solve a problem. I've spent the last decade in entrepreneurship, and if anyone says there's only one way to solve a problem, you've got a problem in the first instance. So it's very complex. It's tricky. It's divisive. It's very animated, but in itself, therefore, I wonder, do we require that level of energy, that animation, that kind of energy? I agree with you. I've been exploring this idea that Aubrey Marcus puts forward of united polarity, which is having a reverence for one another despite our differences, and to actually hold and respect each other's perspectives, even if we completely disagree, and we may feel an inner sense of rage in the moment that we're exploring it, but still to just recognize we are human and to hold that humanity within us and for the other. But do we require the animation? Do we require this kind of othering, this us and them, in order to create evolution? Is that tension necessary? The polarities, that the old adage of opposites attracting, is that energy, that polarity required? And does Integral still permit that polarity, or does it neutralize that polarity to some degree?
Oh, such a good question. And what you're talking about is the real leading edge of human consciousness and evolution right now. And that is, how do we integrate these worldviews and identities? And this is sort of a little bit of an inside baseball part of the theory, integral theory, spiral dynamics theory, that says that the first 6 stages that I've outlined to go up to, indigenous to postmodern, are all based on fear, based on the idea that, I got to find something to eat. I got to find somebody to fight. There's something wrong. The world's been driven into the ditch. And that is just the default intellectual posture of most people, that something's gone terribly, terribly wrong and has to be set right. That every one of those earlier of these first 6 stages have some version of that story. Then there's a big move into the integral stage, where we move from a fear operating system to a creativity operating system. And this is when we realize that, hey, wait a second, maybe this was all supposed to happen. Maybe an 11-year-old was supposed to turn into a 14-year-old. Maybe they're supposed to lose their religion. They're supposed to become alienated and depressed. All of these stages brought forth great fruits and also great senses of deficiency, that once we sort of wrap our head around that, we can say, okay, here we are in this evolving catastrophe that is moving towards, goodness, truth, and beauty in many ways. It's lost goodness, truth, and beauty along the way. There's a way of reintegrating it all. And I'm on board for making that happen. I'm not here to criticize and condemn as much as I am here to build and create and to build bridges and I see this actually, Dan, on social media, and it's sort of an emergent conversation. I see it on Twitter, where people are becoming more and more tired of arguing for their own ideology. It's like, I want to know what my enemies are thinking. How could they, it's a move from how could they think that to how could they think that?
Yes.
What's going on that would be the conclusion that they come to, that, Trump's a good idea, for instance. How could anybody come to that conclusion? And I get curious about that instead of critical. And that is this, fundamental, every stage is fundamentally, it would be shocking. It's the previous stage can't even conceive of it. And this is what's happening now. And I'm pretty excited about it and hopeful about it. And I think the next move politically is for this kind of a new home to be created for the politically homeless, because politically homeless is a stage on the path. It's like, I get that none of these ideologies, none of these political parties is encompassing what I'm about. And there's something new that has to emerge here, and it'll be some integration.
I mean, I suppose that brings us back to the issue of political centrism, being politically centric versus integral. And again, I suppose in evaluating this, I've considered this because on a personal level, I've always had the ability to empathize with classic positions on the left and right. And that's always left me feeling relatively politically homeless, because very few parties have been able to deliver on those priorities. And as such, I've had no political loyalties throughout my career, my adult life. I voted for, in the UK, the Blues, the Reds, the Greens, and the Yellows. It's just, I don't have an affiliation, and it's interesting. I've been on a couple of other, but I've been on other podcasts, and people say it's funny, Dan, because you're able to speak to people on the left and the right, and it's what I believe as a leader is necessary in the world is to be able to see the world from multiple points of view. And I got taught that lesson, interestingly enough, in the business world, because I found that the most innovative teams were the ones that were able to have deepest empathy, not only with just their customers, but actually with each other in the kind of creative process. And it took having a wide range of perspectives in order to come to new distinctions that weren't yet possible. It almost brings the blind spots up to very quickly, that you can then see something much more broader, and it creates something that's greater than the sum of the whole. But it's still difficult. I'll have strong political leanings to the left and right at different times, and they play out in different ways. But we live in this world now where if I put one of those preferences out in the social space, you get attacked for being you get attacked for being a leftist or someone on the far right, depending on what day you're on. And it's frightening how we've got to this point. And I will come to political centrists, but it's made me think of something else in this idea of growing up. Someone said to me the other day, it almost feels like we need to learn how to be human again. And whilst we have evolved, and our measure of evolving has historically been the classic growth model of our technology, our economy, yet at the same time we are suffering with mental health crises. There's ecological challenges, and I'm curious to know whether we are in the digital realm, whether the digital advancements, our evolution of technology has actually regressed whether we have almost a separate self that exists in the digital realm that is less evolved than our physical self. And it may just be a container. If you and I met in the pub and we disagreed, there's always a physical reality that one of us could end up in a tussle if we got to I mean, I don't think you and I would ever get to that point, but there are people that would get someone's point of leverage and it may get physical. We see it happens. But in the digital world, we use that through words, and there's no boundary. And I just wonder whether there's a growing up phase that's required due to the fact that the digital realm has created a different way of communicating and interacting that is separate from our physical selves.
Yeah, no, it has. And perhaps one of the qualities of being human in the future will be that we will have a digital self versus a quote real self. I mean, I don't know how that'll work, but that there would be some additional way of being in the world. Something like that could absolutely happen.
Well, some would argue that the metaverse is becoming that. But again, already social media 1.0 has shown the problems of and psychologists have long spoken about the problems, and we're going off track here, but about creating like an idealized version of ourselves online.
Right. No, we're learning how to do this.
Yes.
And
yes.
Not pretty. Evolution is beautiful, but not pretty.
Yes.
And that's hard to, this world is tough. I mean, it's full of pain and suffering, and at the end, we all get eliminated. We all get the apocalypse is assured for every one of us. That's hard to wrap your head around, and that's true. With that said, there is an evolution is bringing us to ever greater understandings and capacities. And I think one of the ways that we can look at what's happening with social media is that we're gorging on social media right now. We don't have any understanding of what's nutritious and what isn't. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit about what happened when we had all of a sudden in human history, after several 100,000 millions of years of looking for calories and not always finding them, all of a sudden with the industrial food supply, we have, the problem now is obesity and diabetes. We're overeating. A lot of people they can't control that deep human impulse to eat calories. That's also true of information and connection. Human beings are always hungry for information and for connecting to other people. Now, all of a sudden, we have this infinite array of possibilities for consuming information and connection with other people. And, we don't know how quite to act. And actually, it's not such a bad thing that we have an arena that we can enter. We want to be more and more conscious about this with ourselves and each other, but that we can enter an arena and duke it out with other people, and not literally like we used to in the pub.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Actually, there's a progress there. I mean, the human beings have fought generally on the physical level for most of human history. And then it's now on the ideological level. And that is less bloody. I mean, we do character assassination, but we don't do real assassination. I mean, it's not pretty, still not pretty, but it is a move forward in terms of, being more humane. I think we'll probably, fight ideologically for, probably the rest of my life. And at some point, we'll become more post-ideological, where we'll realize these ideologies, they're useful, but they all have a piece of gold to them, and and then we'll probably be fighting on the spiritual level in certain ways. God only knows what's next. It's probably the fight's not going to end, but it does become more humane and less bloody, and always fruitful. I mean, this is sort of a horrible thing to say in a way, but if you look at history, one of the most fruitful aspects of history is war. Wars are terribly destructive, cause huge suffering. But look at Germany and Japan now versus pre-World War II, two of the most humane societies on the planet. That is this fighting is it's painful, but from an integral perspective, we can see that we want to make it that the fight is not optional, but we can make it a fairer fight, a more fruitful fight, a more healthy fight, and that's, I think, where the money is.
Yeah, I always think it's an exciting place to be, because I think many followers of our show have a distinct level of natural curiosity. They have inquiring minds. They question. Our tagline on our old show is "Question everything." They're asking questions. They want to understand things. And what's beautiful about the integral worldview is that it enables you to examine in a healthier buffet, if you will. So you're not gorging. You don't have to go deep on one particular ideology. You get to sample the kind of the good parts, and you understand the limitations, and it starts to help you to embody different ways of seeing the world, whether that's politically, spiritually, or whatever other lens you're applying. So I have a lot more questions around integral, but in the interest of time, what do you think for those who are just discovering integral for the first time? What are some of the first steps that people can take to learning more about the theory of the integral way, and learning more about how we can actually apply some of the concepts?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd point out, you've mentioned centrism, that you just described the difference, I think, pretty well. Is, with centrism as being, I'm going to compromise, and, we're going to move forward, and we're going to keep the tension and all of that good stuff. Integrals, where it's an expansion of human consciousness, where we identify not with any particular worldview, but the space within which worldviews arise. And there's something about that space that is itself enchanted, and so that's the move. And it's an exciting evolutionary move. And there's a site called Integral Life that publishes a lot of stuff in the Ken Wilber lineage of integral thinking. There's the Institute for Cultural Evolution, of which I'm a member of the board. Steve McIntosh, another leading integral philosopher, has started, that is working on political polarization. I would encourage people to check that out. My podcast, The Daily Evolver. I'm on summer break, but I'll keep it going. And I have conversations with people about this and opine on things like, wokeism and environmentalism and religion and all of that good stuff. I would recommend people read a book called The Brief History of Everything by Ken Wilber. That's probably the most accessible book on integral theory. So there's a sort of defined integral world. There's this whole world integral adjacent to, the Merge and you guys and Rebel Wisdom and the Meta Modern, people like that.
Yes.
That is arising, and they all have an integral flavor.
Yes.
That So there's the self-defined, self-conscious evolutionaries, and then there's just the de facto evolutionaries, the people who are just homeless, ready to move on. They like a little bit of everything, or they get everybody. They are sort of a universal donor among their friends. They realize, as we do, that if you state sympathy with one side or the other, the whole world's going to shift.
Yes.
The people who are against you are finally, they understand who you are. You're the enemy. And so you have to navigate that minefield, but it's better than being a right fighter.
Yes. Jeff, this has been a really insightful conversation. Thank you so much for being here on your holiday. It's a pleasure to get to know you, and thank you for sharing not only your wisdom, but some of the flavors of Integral throughout this conversation. And I'm excited to bring more of this to our conversations like this to our audience and bringing Integral to life. I think it is certainly one of the key solutions to not only polarization, cultural wars, but actually many other problems that I think society is facing. It enables us to think differently about our problems, and ultimately it helps us to form more evolved solutions. And I think all of us, no matter what our perspective, our background, where we've come from, whether we live in the world of modernity, postmodernity, traditionalism, or something else, that we can see that there is a need for evolution and there is a need for evolved solutions to the problems of our time. And I think Integral provides a key component in that. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your wisdom on the Elevate podcast.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. I appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
And enjoy your holiday. Thanks so much. Thank you for tuning in today to our interview with Jeff Salzberg. This, for many of you, may have been the first introduction to the concept of integral theory. For myself, I've been curious about the subject for over 10 years now, since originally discovering Ken Wilber's work and spiral dynamics. And it's something that I'm passionately keen to learn more about once again. And we'll be bringing a number of other guests onto the show to explore this further. I do believe it's an important concept for the world we are living in right now, but I also believe it poses several challenges. And one of the questions I'm asking myself is, do we require common adversaries? Do we need to polarize in order to advance? Is this part of the inherent growth path that we're on? In a higher consciousness, it would be wonderful if we lived in greater harmony and respect for one another and still advance culture and society. But is it possible? Do we need conflict in order to grow? These are some of the questions I'll be asking as I bring further guests onto the topic. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Be really fascinated to know your experience when it comes to integral thinking, what your perceptions are if you're new to it for the first time. And thanks again for tuning into the Elevate podcast. Please hit the share button. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, the algorithms are really against us at the moment as we produce counterculture conversations that really push against the edge of the systems. So please hit the share button. And if you haven't already joined our community, come and join us at weareelevate.org and be part of our community of change makers exploring how we can solve many of today's pressing issues. Thanks again for tuning in. My name is Astin-Gregory. This is the Elevate podcast.